Frank stood in front of the mirror and looked at his reflection with excitement. Today, he would take his girlfriend on a date to a restaurant for the first time. He had been preparing for this event for so long, and today he finally made up his mind. Frank's mother, a thin woman with calloused hands from hard work, enthusiastically looked at her son and once again noticed how he resembled his father, who had passed away so early in life. Remembering her husband, the woman's heart filled with pain and longing. No, she had managed to get her share of female happiness in marriage, but if it were not for her husband's severe wound in the war, their happy life together would have lasted longer. One good thing was that she had raised a fine son, an excellent student. Meanwhile, Frank was distracted from his thoughts and painfully looked at his mother. He gave himself a firm promise that when he graduated from university and became a cardiologist, their life would definitely improve. His mother was still saying something, again indulging in memories of his father, but Frank barely heard her anymore. He went back to his own thoughts. Today, 2 months after meeting her, he finally decided to take his relationship with his girlfriend to a more serious level. But the only thing was that he was insanely ashamed of himself in front of her for deceiving her from the very first meeting, pretending to be a wealthy young man. Scarlett was a young woman from a wealthy family. Her father owned a medical centre, and she and her mother didn't need anything and could afford to do whatever they wanted, such as charity work or volunteering. And that is how the young people met. That evening, Scarlett stayed late at the shelter for homeless animals. In fact, it was not her love for poor dogs that brought her here, but an opportunity to show off on the front page of a fashionable high society magazine. That was why she had already spent an hour struggling with disgust, trying to comb the confused, dirty hair of a stray dog, while playfully looking at the lens of the photographer's camera. But at the time, Frank did not know all these details, of course. That evening, his friend Tom asked him to pick up his fancy sports car from the service centre on his behalf. Frank took it away, and he was just driving by the pet shelter when Scarlett finally came out of there. She didn't want to dirty the interior of her new coupe, a gift from her father, and started to hail a cab. It was getting dark, and suddenly a drunken man in old sweatpants came around the corner and started pestering her.
"Hello, hottie. Would you like to spend the evening with a real man?"
he yelled, smiling broadly with his toothless mouth. Scarlett recoiled in horror and took a few steps back. Realizing that he was clearly not welcome, the man instantly became embittered and grabbed the girl firmly by the elbow.
"Don't be afraid. Let's get to know each other,"
he said menacingly, and clamping the girl's mouth, dragged Scarlett into an underpass. "Don't! Let go!" she shouted, trying to break free, but the forces were not equal. Scarlett had already prepared for the worst when suddenly the grip loosened. The bully, doing a somersault, flew somewhere aside and flopped into a puddle. The woman looked up, frightened, to see a young man looking at her cheerfully. "Are you all right? Pretty girls like you shouldn't be walking around this time of day in this neighbourhood," Frank muttered and offered Scarlett a ride home. Scarlett was frightened, but the prospect of being left here alone with an impudent man floundering in the mud and spewing curses did not please her. Besides, Frank's fancy sports car instantly inspired her confidence, and she followed her saviour. On the way, they got to talking, and they found they had a lot in common. They stopped at the quay and chatted cheerfully through most of the night. The moon illuminated their path, and the stars burned overhead. At the same time, one of them fell, and they simultaneously made a wish, which, of course, They did not tell each other, but it was definitely mutual and the same. But when Frank brought Scarlett to the house and saw what a luxurious cottage she lived in, he was very upset, knowing full well that he was not a match for her. But he couldn't tell her the truth, because he was irrevocably in love. From that day on, his lies began. Frank made up a story that his father left him and his mother a good inheritance, and that after graduating from medical school, he would soon get a high-paying job. Scarlett was happy because even though she had no special romantic feelings for the man, he had what she respected the most: money. True, so far he only gave her fancy bouquets of flowers, but she was ready to wait. But the day before their meeting at the restaurant, there was a real disaster, about which Frank knew nothing. For a month he had probably pestered his friend Tom with requests to borrow his car. Of course, his friend was lending it to him without any problem, but he constantly warned Frank that it would not end well. But still, Frank hoped that Scarlett would forgive him his little lie for the sake of their love. After all, if he had not driven that day, their acquaintance would not have happened then. While the young man was excitedly preparing for his date, Scarlett was filled with anger and frustration. A few minutes ago, her friend Megan called and told her that Frank was just a penniless student who had grown up without a father, and that his mother worked all day at a factory. Megan knew this because she had studied with Frank at the same university, and one day she was walking along the park when she saw Scarlett with him. Hearing this, Scarlett almost fainted. She was sitting, and the memory of her embrace with Frank made her shiver with disgust. After thinking for a while, she decided to take revenge on him. Frank, happy with a bouquet of flowers and a small box with a thin gold ring inside, came to her house. Seeing the girlfriend's face twisted with anger, the man immediately darkened. "Well, where's your fancy car?" asked Scarlett sarcastically. Frank told her the whole truth and apologized, and then, getting down on one knee and handing Scarlett the ring, asked her to be his bride. Scarlett laughed out loud, called him a pauper fool, and said other nasty things. Then she grabbed the bouquet and slapped Frank in the face while throwing the box with the ring on the road. Several months have passed since that evening. Frank's pain has somewhat subsided. Soon he graduated from university and began his residency at the cardio-surgical department of the city's main hospital. He devoted all his time to his work, gaining experience from his fellow doctors. One day, at the very end of his internship, an elderly woman in poor condition was brought to the hospital. It was a weekend day, and none of the experienced doctors were present, and Frank conducted his first complicated surgery himself. He was happier than ever that he was able to save the woman's life, but he considered he had only done his duty. A few more years passed. During this time, Frank became a full-fledged doctor who was appreciated by the management and paid a good salary. He saved more than one life, and during this time he completely forgot about his failed engagement. In addition, he met a good woman named Teresa, who worked as a nurse, and between them there was real, sincere feelings. The young people began to prepare for their wedding. Meanwhile, everything in Scarlett's life changed abruptly. Her father was imprisoned for big fraud with medical drugs, and their property was sold for debt. She and her mother had to move into a rented apartment and think about how to make a living. One day, Scarlett was standing at a bus stop waiting for the bus after another unsuccessful job interview. Suddenly, a fancy sports car stopped, and Scarlett, to her great surprise, saw Frank at the wheel. For a moment she was speechless. Frank smiled and offered her a ride home. The woman agreed because she didn't want to go on the bus with the other workers, and besides, she was curious about Frank's life. "How are you doing, Frank? You probably heard what happened to our family. Life isn't fair. By the way, did you borrow the car from a friend again?" asked Scarlett, a little arrogantly. "No, I bought that car myself. I'm doing great. I work as a cardiac surgeon. There's a waiting list for my surgery for months to come. And I heard about your father. I'm sorry for you," Frank answered simply. Scarlett, hearing that Frank now had the money, quickly realized that maybe this would be her chance, and smiling languidly, touched Frank's hand and said, "Frank, forgive me. I was wrong then. I was outraged, and really I apologize for what I did. Maybe let's start over? You were in love with me." Frank looked at Scarlett, humiliating herself in front of him, and without laughing or sneering, simply said that he had nothing to forgive her for, because they had always been strangers to each other. But thanks to her, he had learned to appreciate real happiness and understand what real love was. Scarlett didn't have time to say anything, because they had already arrived at her home. Only this time, it was not a fancy mansion, but an old high-rise. "Goodbye, Scarlett," said Frank, and turned to the window, waiting for her to come out. Scarlett jumped out of the car like a bullet, slamming the door loudly. A couple of months later, Frank and Teresa got married and were soon getting ready to become parents.